Alrighty, we're going to answer the question, how to make oyster bisque. Now that's the one bisque of the bisques that are in this series that you have least likely to probably have encountered. And it is made exactly the way the other bisques are made, with the exception of the primary ingredient is oysters, instead of lobster or shrimp or crayfish. So we're going to start this out just like we started out all the other ones, and that is with whole butter in your pot. And mirepoix, the recipe that you have, the ingredient list calls for 1 cup each celery, carrots, and onions, which is what I have here, diced mirepoix. And we're going to put a little bit more butter in there. And some dried leaf thyme. And we're going to put a little bit of pepper and a little bit of salt in here. Now, if I appear mechanical in the way I make this bisque, it's because I've made them so many times, and I always make them the same way. I always cook mirepoix, add some garlic and some spices or whatever it is I'm going to add the primary ingredient, cook it a little bit, add white wine, reduce it, add stock, add rice, bring it to a boil, puree it, reduce it, cream it, and season it. It's always the same, and it always turns out good if you follow this particular formula. So we're going to put a little bit of fresh ground pepper in there, just a touch, because again, you're always keeping in mind that you don't want to add final seasonings that are going to affect the final outcome of the soup too early, because there's reducing involved and so on and so forth. I mean, in terms of salt and pepper. Okay? Alrighty, now we're going to let that cook for about 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to time elapse this and come right back in 3 or 4 minutes. So we'll be back right now. That 3 or 4 minutes has passed, and I've been standing here babysitting the pot. And I just wanted to show you that the mirepoix, the celery, carrots, and onions, are cooked 1/2 to 3/4 of the way. Now, what you want to be careful that you don't do is you're not browning these vegetables. This is not a brown soup per se. You're just cooking them until they're almost tender enough to eat in this particular case. Now we're going to put the garlic in the soup. And I'd call that the prescribed amount based on the ingredient list, of course, you know. And the oysters. Now I have here, and you should be able to buy these in just about every local supermarket in the country has these fresh oysters. And these are in what they call the oyster liqueur. Now keep in mind that the oyster liqueur, and I'll dump these in here so you can see how they come. They come by the cup, but the container is actually 8 ounces, so it's 1/2 pound each. Now these are big, nice big oysters too. These are nice, and they smell good. My point about the liqueur, which is important to understand when you're making this particular soup, being sure not to burn your garlic, of course, is that the oyster liqueur, here, let me dump this in here. Oyster liqueur is the liquid essence of the oyster, and it needs to be part of this. If, for example, you are shucking oysters in a shell, make sure that you save what's called the oyster liqueur, which is what that is, okay? Now, we're going to give that a little stir. And I'm going to time elapse this forward about 3 or 4 minutes, just enough time for the oysters to cook. Then I'm going to bring you right back in, and we're going to put the rice and the chicken stock on it, and we're going to let it simmer. So I'm going to let it cook now for 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes right now. Okay, that 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, give or take, has elapsed, and I want you to take a peek at the oysters. They're 1/2 to 3/4 of the way cooked. All righty. You got that oyster liqueur in there. That pot smells very nice. It smells like fresh oysters. One of the things about this soup that you're going to like if you make it is if you like oysters, this is like drinking oysters a little bit in the soup. Unlike every other soup I've had where the oysters tend to be whole in chowders and things like that, they taste good, but they only kind of taste like oyster a lot when you're eating one of the oysters. In this particular soup, every spoonful tastes like oyster, which is kind of neat. All right, so now I'm going to put the white wine on it and reduce that briefly. That would be the prescribed amount, I think, based on the ingredient list. And I'm going to time elapse this again, and we're going to reduce the wine by 75%, and I'll be back in about 5 more minutes again with a time elapsed reduced pot. Okay, that 5-7 minutes has elapsed, and the white wine has now been reduced by 75%, and this pot is now ready for the rice, which is the small amount of rice that you're going to use as a thickening agent for the bisque. Throughout this series, in the bisque soups, we have used rice in each case to thicken the soup, along with the pureed vegetable and so on that happens to be in there. So, we're going to add the rice. And you got to be careful when you add rice to this, because that's plenty of rice to start with, because you want to make sure you don't put too much rice in, because you puree it, it's too thick. And here, let me add this chicken stock to it. This recipe calls for about 1.5 quarts. This recipe calls for about 1 quart and a cup, 5 cups, give or take, which is about what's in there. We're going to let that come to a simmer and let it boil, but as I was starting to say, if you should happen to put too much rice inside the bisque soup and then you puree it, if it's too thick, you have to dilute it with something. And when you dilute it with whatever it is you dilute it with, you're going to dilute the flavor. So the name of the game here is to add the amount of rice, probably less than you think you need. Now, my recipe and that formula will work in all cases, but in every single case of a soup like this, you still have to make a texture adjustment at the end of it. You have to look at it, decide whether or not it's too thick, too thin. Should it be reduced some more? Should I add a little cornstarch to it, or whatever it is you want to add to it, a little pinch of roux or whatever it is? You're still going to have to make that decision, but you want to avoid making it too thick on the very front end. So I'm extending caution to you when you make this, that's how you should approach the process. Putting in a little bit less than you think you need. You can always add a little more to it. All right, we're going to time elapse this and let it boil for 10 minutes or so, give or take. You give the stock time to become part of the whole soup, and everything will be like soft and pureeable. As soon as it's pureeable, then we're going to puree it, and then we're going to finish it off. So I'll be back in 5-8 minutes, something like that, right now. All right, we're back at the time that has elapsed is approximately about 7 to 9 minutes we took off there. And this stock has been simmering with the rice and the mirepoix and the oysters in it, and the garlic and the reduced white wine. And now we're going to put it in a cylindrical container, something that would be a little bit more conducive to it pureeing more effectively, okay? In a big pot like this, it's harder to puree it unless you have a real powerful puree stick, okay? Okay, we're going to take our, what I call the zapper, and give this a zap. One of the things you'll notice when you're making oyster bisque versus shrimp or lobster, which would be the 2 most popular ones, and the ones that are made by the most people, is the oyster bisque, because there's a little bag inside of each oyster that when it's pureed, it causes the soup to become green, a little bit, a shade of green. So that's what you should be looking for in your soup. Some oysters, of course, will cause it to be more green than others, so they're not all going to be exactly the same shade. Let me just have a little taste of that. Let's take a look at the texture of this soup real quick for you. The soup is a little bit chunky still. Let's taste it. Tasting nice and oystery. Let's give it some more puree. Okay, I think we got it enough here. Now let's take another peek at that texture. It's coming along okay. You certainly could puree it more if you want to. Let me give it a little bit more of a zap here. Just give me 1 more minute or less, and then we'll stick it back in the pot. There we go. Now, I would say that guesstimating with the addition of rice, which is what I was doing, I was fairly accurate because you see the texture of the soup seems like it's just about where it needs to be. Let's put it back on the stove in the saucepan. Let's bring it up to a quick boil here. And what I did during this last time elapsed moment was I took some, I took some cream, heavy cream, and reduced it on the stove here down to sauce consistency, because you'll notice that in your ingredient list it calls for heavy cream that's been reduced to sauce consistency. So when we add it to the soup, we don't thin the soup out in the process. Okay, the soup is back to a simmer already. And I like the way this is. I like where the texture's at in it all together. We're going to put it back in here, and we're going to finish it right now in here. And you're going to be drinking lobster bisque soup. Now, if you take all the time elapsed moments in this particular lesson, you'll probably, in total time, it'll probably take you about 35, 40 minutes to make this soup from start to finish, which is great. Okay, first we're going to start the brandy burning. And we're going to do that. I believe this recipe calls for 3 or 4 ounces, 5 ounces, 6 ounces of brandy. There's a variance here in what amount of brandy you can add to it. Now, some people might say, let's add some apple brandy to this. So I'd be careful about doing that. Doesn't mean it wouldn't turn out good, but how much you put in is kind of a little bit up to you. Now, be aware that it is going to burst into flames like it just did. Okay? Let's give it just a touch more. Now, Louis, I need to have the sherry, so bring that over. And then, now, in the case of the lobster and the shrimp, the sherry is used much more, and it kind of makes more sense in that soup. With the oyster, be careful about how much. Thank you, Richard. Be careful about how much you use. Okay. Now it's boiling. You see the thing is flaming. I'm going to shut it off. You don't need the fire going once that's on. Now we're going to finish the soup. We're going to begin the process of finishing. The first thing you do when you're finishing the soup, this soup or any soup, is look at the texture of the soup and decide whether or not you're satisfied with this. This particular case, I've already told you that it is, and it looks good. Next, in this particular case, we're going to be buttering the soup. Again, it's 4 ounces of whole unsalted butter, 2 ounces per quart, 2 ounces of whole unsalted butter per quart of soup, or sauce for that matter. So we're going to take a little bit of butter. I got a couple of quarts of soup here, so we'll stick about the equivalent of 1 stick of butter into here. And let's zap it in. Part of the reason why I wanted to put it back in this container to do the finishing process is that I would be able to puree it better, and it would even puree more and be even smoother. Bisque soups should be smooth soups. They're not chunky soups, period. Okay, now we're going to add the reduced cream. Let's zap that in there. Let's give this a taste, but we can add the brandy to it first. Brandy's still got a little bit of flame left on it, but not much. There it goes. It all went out now. Now this here is what you call burnt brandy. This is brandy that's been burnt completely. The fire went out on its own. That's like a flavoring agent that we're adding near the end of the soup. Remember, Brandy is nothing but old aged white wine. Has a different kind of flavor. Not, I wouldn't say similar to white wine, but that's where it comes from, you know? All right, let's try this out before we start putting any salt in here. The soup is good. I'm going to put a pinch of sherry in here, not much. I think that's all this is going to need. It needs a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper. Now, in the case of the oyster bisque, the cayenne pepper is not considered to be the normal pepper for this bisque, as it is with the shrimp and the lobster. That's the standard French pepper that's added to it. But in the case of the oyster, you can or cannot. There's no traditional bond with the pepper either way. Okay, let's give that a taste. The soup looks good and tastes good. This soup is just about finished. This soup needs a pinch of salt. The soup needs no sugar added to it whatsoever. Unlike the shrimp and the lobster, which you might put a pinch of sugar in, see? I think we're right where we need to be here. I'm going to put a few drops of sherry in. I love this soup, by the way. Now this, you wouldn't necessarily put whole cooked oysters in this soup like you would with shrimp and lobster for the garnish, and you could. But if you did, I would say that you get some really tiny oysters and cook them and put them in there. But certainly isn't necessary because this whole soup tastes like oysters. Let's do one more taste before we commit ourselves to putting it in a bowl. Soup is good. Just one more little pinch of salt. There we go. Alrighty, let's take a peek at it in the bowl. Get some of our mess out of the way here. Okay. Breadcrumbs in the bowl. Alrighty. Looks nice. This one has a very light shade of green, almost has a little yellow tint to it, okay? We're going to throw a piece of baguette bread that's been fried in some clarified butter, which is the way we made the croutons for the other bisques. And if you want to learn how to make this crouton, just go to one of the other bisque recipes at the end and it'll show you. There's a little chopped parsley, and I wouldn't do much more to this for fear of overkill. And of course, in all the cases of soups of this shade of color, you want to put a little minced tomato, little couple pieces of roasted red pepper, something like that in there. You certainly can, and it will effectively work with the presentation. But this is nice, and it doesn't need much. So there you have oyster bisque. Enjoy it. If you haven't had it, it's a soup that you should definitely make and try one day, because we've all had shrimp and lobster pretty much, either at home or out. But this one, you want to impress your friends with a bisque soup, this might be the one to make for them. Good luck with this one.